In 1929, it started with a stock crash. Fortunes were wiped out, people killed themselves in despair, and the Great Depression of the 1930s had finally arrived. Well, today on Renegade News, we're discussing what happened in the 30s so that you can compare it to the current recession that we're in, and whether the Biden administration wants to call it that or not, we are. But what you're going to see as you look at the trends is what we're going into could be worse than the Great Depression of the 30s. Welcome back to Renegade News. I'm your host, Glenn Kowalski. Every week on this channel, we discuss the latest news, strategies, and tactics you need to break free from the system, pay less tax, and live anywhere in the world that you want. So is this a recession? Is this a depression? Where are we actually heading with our current trend? Well, let's take a look at the trends that happened back in the 30s, because Jeremy Powell and the media want us to believe that what they're seeing is just a recession and it's not a depression. And Joe Biden and his administration want us to think that it's not a recession at all. So they've been going around and changing all the definitions. But what is the truth and what's the difference between the two? Does that matter what we call it? Well, generally, a recession is a downturn in economic conditions, but a depression is a deeper and a more long-term prolonged downswing. Now, a recession is a period of negative economic growth, generally 2 quarters by the old definition. Now, although recessions can be really scary, they are a more natural part of the economy. So while recessions can be worrying, it's important to not be scared of them, but to prepare for them so that you're not caught off guard. There are times when businesses have to make changes in their spending and in their investments, and they have to become more efficient. However, when it becomes a depression, that has to be more universally concerning to everyone, regardless of what you're doing. So let's look at some of the causes and effects of the Great Depression, and you can make up your own mind as to whether this is the same direction we're heading now. So first of all, we had the stock crash of 1929, which everybody knows about. And so that was created because during the 1920s, the US stock market was undergoing this historic expansion, and as stock prices rose to these unprecedented levels, interest in investing in the stock market came to be seen as this really easy way to make money. Sound like anything that you've heard of in the past? And even people who are just ordinary means started to use a whole lot of their disposable income, and on non-disposable income, they started to mortgage their homes to buy more stock so they can make these fast dollars. So by the end of the decade, hundreds of millions of shares were being carried on margin, meaning that their purchase price was financed with loans that had to be repaid with profits generated from the ever-increasing share prices. This is fine as long as the prices are going up. But once prices began their inevitable decline in October of 1929, millions of overextended shareholders fell into a panic and rushed to liquidate their holdings. So that sped up the decline and served to further push through the panic that was going on. Now, between September and November of that year, the stock prices fell 33%. And that was a result of a profound psychological shock and a loss of confidence in the economy. And that loss of confidence happened between both consumers and businesses. The next thing that happened was there was less spending. So there was a reduction in this purchasing across the board. So accordingly, consumer spending, especially on durable goods and business investments, were drastically curtailed. And that led to a reduced industrial output and job losses, which then further reduced that spending and investment, starting to build this snowball. You can see how that's starting to happen now. So people's investments became worthless. Their savings started to be diminished or completely depleted, and credit started to tighten up to the point where it was non-existent. So spending by consumers and companies both ground to this total standstill. And as a result, workers started to get laid off in mass. So because of this, that kicked off this chain reaction where people lost their jobs. They were unable to keep up with paying for items they bought through their installment plans. And then repossessions and evictions became a commonplace as people started to foreclose on their properties because they were getting behind on these loans. So that then caused there to be more and more unsold inventory on the market, and that began to build up and accumulate on the market. The unemployment rate at the same time rose above 25%, which meant that even less spending was happening, so there was nothing that could alleviate that economic situation of those slowdowns. Next on the list, we had this monetary supply issues, where banks started to fail and people started to panic. Nearly 700 banks failed in the last months of 1929, and more than 3,000 collapsed in 1930. At that time, there was no federal deposit insurance. So when the banks failed, people lost all of their money. That caused them to panic. Once those people started to panic, that caused the bank runs as people desperately withdrew their money, which then caused more banks to start to close. By the end of that decade, more than 9,000 banks had totally failed. And the surviving institutions, because they didn't know what the economic situation was and they were concerned for their own survival, became completely unwilling to lend more money. So of course, once again, that snowball started to increase, and that led to less and less spending. Now, unfortunately, all these things going on were building on each other, but that wasn't all. There were also problems outside of the banking issues at the exact same time. For example, in agriculture and the collapse of world trade in agriculture due to the Smoot-Hawley tariff. In the late 1920s, while the U.S. economy was still expanding, lending by U.S. banks to foreign countries started to fall, partially because of relatively high U.S. interest rates at the time. That drop-off contributed to a contractionary effect in some of the borrower countries, particularly places like Germany, Argentina, and Brazil, whose economies were starting to enter a downturn even before the beginnings of the Great Depression in the United States. Now, meanwhile, at the same time, American agricultural interests were suffering because of overproduction and increased competition from European and other agricultural producers. So they went and lobbied Congress for the passage of new tariffs on agricultural imports. Congress then eventually adopted a broad legislation, which is called the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act in 1930, and that imposed steep tariffs averaging around 20% on a wide range of agriculture and industrial products. That legislation naturally provoked retaliatory measures by several other countries, and the cumulative effect was declining output in several countries and a reduction in global trade. Now, as if all of that wasn't bad enough on its own, then the climate stepped in and we started to experience a drought. And the economic devastation of the Great Depression was made so much worse by that environmental destruction. There was a years-long drought that struck, coupled with farming practices which didn't use soil preservation techniques, and that created a vast region from the southeast of Colorado to the Texas Panhandle that became known as the Dust Bowl. Massive dust storms choked towns, killed crops, and killed livestock. It made people sick, and it caused millions of dollars worth of damage. This meant that thousands fled the region as the economy there collapsed, something that John Steinbeck chronicled in his masterpiece, The Grapes of Wrath. It would be years, if not decades, before the region's environment recovered from that drought. You can read more about the Great Depression and how farmers tried to fight the government in our blog, The Great Depression Deja Vu. Where have we seen this before? I'm going to leave a link to that down in the description below. But I'm going to leave you with the reassuring words of Laura Ulrich, senior regional economist with the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond. The way people think about a depression is a more widespread and severe recession. But there's no clear-cut moment where we can say we hit X unemployment rate or Y GDP growth. We're now officially in a depression. So that means that the government's always going to be able to change definitions to call it a recession, call it a depression. What you really want to look at, where we are economically and what's on the doorstep. Because whether we're in a recession or a depression or in the best economy in our lifetime, like the current administration would like you to believe, the secret to surviving and prospering is having the right strategies. You have to learn how to grow your income, protect your assets, and create a better and safer lifestyle for yourself and for your family in any economy. And that's why you should subscribe to Renegade News right now. Our mission is to help renegades like you find more freedom and independence in this unfree world. And Renegade News and Renegade News Live exist solely for the purpose to help you break free from the system, pay less tax, and live anywhere in the world that you want. While you're here, check out the video you see on the screen right now. It's our latest upload, and we're going to discuss topics like cryptocurrency, running and growing a business, asset protection, and so much more. I'm Glenn Kowalski from Renegade News, and I'll see you over there.